Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to the hot month of June. And there are a few things to know about June. The first, and arguably more important if the person you're speaking to is my mum, is that it is my birthday in June. So I have just turned the grand old age of 23. I wish, 33. I've just turned 33 and I spent the weekend at Hay Festival in Hay-on-Wye in Wales, which is a book festival, and it was a beautiful place to spend a birthday surrounded by books and other people who love books. And that's going to feature in an upcoming reading vlog about a holiday I've been on to Ireland and to Hay Festival. The other thing to know about June, and the actual more important thing about June, is that June is gay. It's something we have in common. Sometimes June and I brunch together, but indeed June is Pride Month. And so with that in mind, I thought I would put together this video to make some reading suggestions that can make your bookshelves a little bit more gay this month. I mean, all of our shelves should be very gay all year round. But during Pride Month, it's a lovely time to take stock and think about the fiction that we're reading. It's worth mentioning at this point that Pride Month is, of course, about all genders and sexualities, and it's not my intention in this video to represent all of those. My focus is on books about men who are in love with men. And so I've got 5 books I've read and 5 books that I haven't that I hope you'll consider reading this month. I'll start with the ones I have read, and the first one I want to tell you about is Love in the Big City by Sang-Young Park, translated from the original Korean by Anton. And apparently I've come dressed as this book today. This looks a little bit like I'm just holding a pack of cigarettes. This was nominated for the International Booker Prize in 2022, and it's actually a collection of 4 stories all following the same protagonist, and it feels a lot like autofiction. The main character is referred to as Mr. Young or Mr. Park at various points, and we follow the main character through various points in his 20s and 30s. It is primarily about gay love, but it's also about love for friends and for family, love for yourself and love for Kylie, both Minogue and another Kylie. Pardon me for not elaborating any further. You'll have to read it and find out for yourself who the other Kylie is. One thing I really like about this book is its representation of men that don't fit the standard mould for like male beauty. The main character is overweight, but it's just mentioned, it's just a fact of the book, and this character still participates in gay culture and gay life and sex and relationships, and that's really great. From experience, gay dating can sometimes feel pretty superficial and skin deep, and that's certainly reflected in the book, but it's not the main point of it. The book is funny and touching and unapologetic, and I'd really encourage you to give it a try. It's also from a small press, Tilted Axis Press, and I love the opportunity to support a small press. The next book that I want to tell you about that I have read is Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Does this have the best title on this list? Almost certainly yes. This was Ocean Vuong's debut novel, and before that he was primarily a poet. And it really shows in this beautiful lyrical novel about a character called Little Dog, who's the child of Vietnamese immigrants growing up in rural America. It takes the form of a letter written by Little Dog to his mother. He's telling her the things that he's not been able to say over the course of his growing up. And they're things that she'll never be able to read because she's too illiterate to read them. Her education was disrupted by the war in Vietnam. It's a ponderous, tender novel told almost in vignettes, and I loved its preoccupation with symbolism and language, and I just found it really, really interesting. He has so much to say on sexuality and race and the immigrant experience, and particularly the pressure on second-generation immigrants to translate between the world that they live in and the world of their parents, both literally in language, but also metaphorically in sort of culture and other ways. I do remember being a bit switched off towards the end. I can't remember why. I think maybe it got a little bit too poetic for me, but overall it was a rich and rewarding read, and it is just such sumptuous text that I would not recommend missing out on. Next is another debut novel, this time from Brandon Taylor and his book Real Life. This is a campus novel following a biochemistry student called Wallace over a hot, sticky summer's weekend. He's in a friendship group that is primarily white, and he keeps his distance from them for various reasons. This has some really great scenes. There is a fantastically awkward dinner party scene, and I love an awkward dinner party scene. There should be more of them in novels. I was also weirdly fascinated by the scenes we saw of him working in the lab. He's doing these experiments on these tiny little microscopic worms called nematodes, and reading about the process just really intrigued me. But there's also lots of enjoyment to get out of the awkwardness and shitty situations that he gets into with his difficult and horrible colleagues. In all of these settings, there's this really accomplished way that Brandon Taylor approaches Wallace navigating his blackness in these mostly white spaces, as well as the mostly white characters he's surrounded by navigating his blackness as well, often poorly. It is worth being aware that there is some sexual violence in this book, so if that's something that you don't want to read about, then maybe give this one a swerve. But overall, I remember the whole thing just feeling so sweaty and melancholy, and I think it summed up both campus experience but also that late summer feeling really, really well. Interestingly, both this and On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous were winners of the Foyles Book of the Year. So Foyles, you've got great taste. Okay, so far these have all been pretty recent releases, but now we're going to take a step back to the 1960s, arguably the best decade for fiction. In fact, I definitely believe that it's the best decade for fiction, and I'm going to do a video on that at some point. The book I want to talk about now, though, is A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood. What I love about this is that it's not about a young gay man coming to terms with his sexuality, but instead we're following an older gay man who knows who he is, knows who he loves, but he's in mourning. Our protagonist, George, is coming to terms with life on his own after his partner, Jim, unexpectedly dies. We follow George as he navigates his job as a professor at a university, his interpersonal relationships, his interactions with his neighbours, as he mourns his new reality. It's really beautifully written, it's very, very melancholy, and it's also not very long at all, so you've got no excuse not to read it. I think there's just something fascinating about reading a book that was written in the 60s at a time when being gay was a lot less accepted, more taboo, potentially still illegal in the UK. I can't actually remember when it stopped becoming illegal, but it was just a really different time. And so to read something that was probably quite provocative, probably quite brave to write, I think it's an important part of gay literary history. The last of the books that I have read that I want to tell you about is Swimming in the Dark by Tomasz Jedrowski. I was about to lay into the publisher for not putting the translator's name anywhere on this book, but it turns out I'm an idiot and it was actually written in English. This is a coming-of-age story set in 1980s communist Poland, when it was a criminal offence to be gay. It's the story of a character called Ludwig who's looking back on his life, and particularly over one summer when he went to some sort of farming camp. And while he's at that camp, he meets one of the great loves of his life, a character called Janusz. It's a love that divides his life into the before and the after. One of the things I loved about this book was the main character's life-changing experience of reading James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. It's a book I still haven't read, but it really makes me want to get to it. And even remembering reading this urges me to pick up Giovanni's Room. Because while at the camp, Ludwig reads this printed out, unauthorized copy of the book, and he really falls in love with it. This book is really sexy and romantic and political, but it's also heartbreaking, and this book does this really perfect thing of being just long enough to make you fall in love with the book and the characters, but it's also just short enough to leave you wanting more. It's not a very long book, and I could have read another 100 pages of it, but as it is, it's just so perfectly formed. The complete opposite to A Single Man, but no less compelling for it. So those were the 5 books that I've read. Now on to the 5 that I haven't. And the first one I want to tell you about is Bola by Patjim Statovci, translated from the original Finnish by David Hackston. It's interesting that although this was written in Finnish, it's actually set in Kosovo, which feels surprising, but maybe it shouldn't be. I think that's some weird Anglo-centric view that fiction written in a certain country is more likely to be about and set in that country. But yeah, this is set against the backdrop of the Kosovo War in the 90s. It tells the story of Arsim, who meets and falls in love with a married man called Milos, and the Bola of the title is some mythical, legendary evil serpent that they use as a language to explore their love for each other. Beyond that, though, I don't know too much about this one, and I'm not sure I want to know. I just want to read it. It's not very long, so it shouldn't take that long to get through. It has just come out in paperback with a fairly sexy, dark male torso on the cover, which I'm not sure how I feel about. On the one hand, yes please. On the other hand, it makes it look a little bit like trashy fiction, but who am I to judge? Very keen to dive into this either way. And now from one red book to another, we move to Taymoor Soomro's Other Names for Love. This is set in Pakistan, where 16-year-old Farhad has been sent by his father to toughen him up a bit, make him a man. Except Farhad falls in love with another boy, so unlucky dad. It's a book about young love, masculinity, father-son relationships. And I think that's quite an interesting theme. I can't think of too many books that focus on the experience of a gay son and his relationship to his father. More often than not, fathers are quite absent from these stories, or they reject their son and it's a story of familial strife. So I'm really interested to see how this is handled in the book. Next is a book called The World and All That It Holds by Aleksandr Hemon. This novel starts on the day that Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. The Archduke, not the band, but it's also the day that Pinto and Osman meet. And then we follow them over the decades as they deal with war and displacement and travel and espionage. I really love a big, sweeping, continent-hopping novel, and this one sounds brilliant. I was actually lucky enough to go and see Aleksandr Hemon give a talk about this book when he released it earlier in the year. And what I found interesting is that Hemon is someone who is writing in a second language. He didn't originally speak English until he moved to the US when he was younger to become a journalist. But what that's left with him is a fascination with language and meaning and translation, and sometimes the untranslatability of local sayings and idioms. And I think these are peppered throughout the book and used often in their original languages. And that sounds pretty great. Our second to last book is by Akwaeke Emezi, and it's The Death of Vivek OG. Emezi seems to be one of the most prolific modern authors, and somehow, although I have acquired a few of their books, I've managed not to read any of them yet. Emezi has written so many books in so many different genres, from memoir to young adult to romance. This is a literary fiction book, though, set in Nigeria, that was released a few years ago. This is another one that I don't know too much about. Obviously, we know that Vivek OG is dead, so that's not a spoiler, but I'm really intrigued to learn about what happened and why over the course of this novel. Obviously, I know a little bit to have included it in this list, and I know that it's about coming to terms with sexuality in a place and at a time where to do so puts yourself at risk of violence. One thing I have heard about this book is that it's written with a very Nigerian perspective for a Nigerian audience, rather than trying to cater to an American or British audience. And I love that. I'm sure it's a fantastic read, although I expect it's going to be quite a heavy one. The final book to tell you about is Mr. Loverman by Bernadine Evaristo. And after her Booker Prize winning Girl, Woman, Other, this is probably her second most well-known and widely read book. This is about a septuagenarian black man called Barry, married to a woman called Carmel, with whom he has children and grandchildren, except he has been in a relationship with his childhood and best friend for 60 years. This book covers the revelation of that affair and how Barry deals with it, not just within his family and the fallout there, but also within his older Black Caribbean community. Barry's supposed to be a really excellent, exciting, interesting character, and unlike a lot of the books on this list, this one's been described as being full of warmth and humour. Evaristo is such a brilliant writer, and I'm really in awe of the way that she's able to make her characters really distinct and real people. The fact that in Girl, Woman, Other she had these 12 characters who all felt like realistic individuals still astonishes me, and so I have really high hopes for this one. I think it's going to be great. So those are 10 books that I think you could put on your list for Pride Month and have an excellent reading month. But don't limit yourself to June, read them all year round. If you don't get to them this month, don't fret, there's never a bad time to read a gay book. If you've got any recommendations of gay fiction that you'd like to share, I'd love to hear about them in the comments, or if you've read any of the ones here that I've talked about, then let me know what you thought. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, it helps me out enormously. And if you're not yet subscribed, then there's a subscribe button somewhere on the page, I'm sure, so give that a tap and you'll get a new video from me each week. But until next time, toodles. Don't leave me high and dry.